Okay, good afternoon, everybody. And I just want to finish off our discussion about plant evolution by doing a very short section on angiosperm evolution. Angiosperms are the flowering plants, and they originated at least 140 million years ago. They are now, for most areas of the world, they are the dominant vegetation type that we see all around us. Although, of course, gymnosperms are also common in many areas. So there is something of a mystery about the origins of the angiosperms, especially in their relationship to the gymnosperms. We know that around about 140 million years ago, they begin appearing in the fossil record. We see not only the plants themselves, parts of the flowers, but we also see records of the pollen, which is quite distinctive. Their relationship to one another is also very unclear. We recognize some major groups of angiosperms, but exactly how they are related and in ancestral terms is not always clear. What we do know is that when angiosperms are pollinated by insects or by animals of some sort, this is a major driver of the evolution of individual angiosperm lines. They can develop extremely close relationships to their pollinators. The plants adapt to the pollinator adapts to the plants, and they become tied in an intimate relationship, sometimes so intense that for many orchids, for example, and some other plants as well, they only have one pollinator. There's only one particular insect, for example, which can pollinate them. Many of the angiosperms are wind pollinated as well, and that we'll talk about in a minute. Okay, so the first thing to understand about about when a plant is fertilized by an insect or an animal of some sort is that the plant actually tricks the pollinator into coming in to gather pollen. Pollination by an insect or some other animal is actually a very precise way of ensuring fertilization of the ovum of the megaspore. Plants which are pollinated by insects, in particular, don't have to produce much pollen. They can produce a smaller amount of pollen, invest far less in producing the pollen because it is going to be picked up by a specific organism and is going to be carried to another flower, whatever, and the fertilization is efficiently conducted. In case of a wind pollination, just as we saw for the gymnosperms, they actually have to produce a lot of pollen to ensure that fertilization will take place. So those angiosperms which use animals to pollinate them, they're actually pulling the animals in to effect the transfer of pollen. But they may pull the animals in by various means. The pollen itself is very nutritive. So, for example, bees come in specifically to collect pollen and to use it. But in collecting pollen from many flowers, they transfer pollen from flower to flower to flower. But the flowers may also offer other things. For example, they produce sweet liquids, a nectar, which bees, for example, also collect, but many, many insects do. I'll tell you for a start, that mosquitoes are actually basically nectar feeding insects. They're not blood feeding. Only the female mosquito feeds on blood when she's ready to produce eggs. The rest of the time, male mosquitoes exclusively feed on nectar, and female mosquitoes spend most of their time feeding on nectar. And in doing so, they are very important pollinators. They transfer pollen from one plant to another. Plants may also offer other products. They may offer waxes, for example, which many insects will use. So there are all sorts of things which the plant will produce as a trap, pulling the insects or the other organisms may pollinate them as well. For example, wasps, beetles, and on, all the way up to mammals, to birds, rodents, all sorts of animals act as pollinators. And they come to the plants with with a specific driver bringing them in, a specific attractor, let's say, pulling them in. So the ancestors of both the angiosperms and the gymnosperms diverged about 305 million years ago. That is our estimate. We see in the plant fossil record some very primitive forms of angiosperms which look like advanced gymnosperms. So there is a sort of a gray area before the angiosperms emerge as a clear group. They now have, by estimate, 250,000 different species of angiosperm. Unfortunately, many of them are now highly endangered because of habitat destruction and because of global climate change. So there is an older system of classification which we are going to use. It's a useful system which divides the angiosperms into 3 groups. These 3 groups have been mixed up a little bit by a DNA analysis, so it becomes a little bit unclear, but we'll use them anyway because it's a useful division. The first is to see that there is a primitive group of angiosperms. They're called the basal angiosperms, and they include the Magnoliids, the whole group called the Magnoliids. And these are regarded as being primitive angiosperms. Then there are 2 other groups. The first are the monocotyledons, and the second are the dicotyledons. They are now referred to as the Eudicotyledons. So the Magnoliids are the beautiful magnolia trees we see blooming now, starting to bloom now all over New York, very common in the southern states. And but they're also, magnolias are also found widely distributed in Asia as well. And they are regarded as being primitive angiosperm group for some very obvious reasons. First, when you hear they have huge petals, and those petals, when you look at them, are arranged in a spiral. That is very reminiscent of the gymnosperms. Gymnosperms, on their reproductive bodies, those reproductive leaves are arranged in a spiral. In addition, the Magnoliids have a cone, and again, it's arranged as they're arranged as a spiral. Each of these that you see here is an ovule with a stigma and a style on it. And they're arranged in the spiral, but they form a cone, and so do the male parts. They are also in the form of a cone. So these are regarded as being more primitive angiosperms. They're neither monocotyledonous nor dicotyledonous. They're definitely not gymnosperms, but they have some alliance to the gymnosperms. So the rest, by far the bulk of the angiosperms, are separated into these 2 groups, the monocotyledons and the dicotyledons, or the Eudicotyledons. And this the name comes from reference to the first seed leaf that is produced. This is part of the embryo, and it tends to absorb a lot of nutrient from that storage, the endosperm, which is the 3N triploid tissue of the seed. And the cotyledons absorb a lot of the nutrient from there and act as a further nutrient store for the growing plant once it germinates. In the monocotyledons, which are we'll see now in grasses and things like that, there is just 1 cotyledon produced, and then the true leaves are produced afterwards. In the dicotyledons, there are two cotyledons, as the name implies. There's one there and there's one there. And here in the center is an axillary bud, which is going to actually grow to form the first shoot. So these are the cotyledons here. These are bean plants. You can see here and here, those are cotyledons. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. These are true dicotyledons, eudicotyledons. So the monocotyledons are a huge group, vast and extremely, extremely diverse. Some well-known plants which you will know about. First of all, the orchids, for example, those are monocotyledons. So all the lilies and things like that. These are obviously fertilized by pollinator, by another organism, an animal, which comes in to gather pollen and transfers pollen from one to the other. Some of these, the orchids especially, have an incredibly intimate relationship to their pollinator, to the extent that some orchids, for example, produce pheromones. These are hormones which travel through the air, scents, which pull pollinators in. For example, they may produce the scent of a female wasp and pull in male wasps, which will come in seeking the female, and in doing so gather pollen and transfer it between plants. Many of the monocotyledons actually are wind pollinated, and there is no, in these cases where they are animal pollinated, they may have very elaborate flowers which serve to attract the pollinator, not only to attract the pollinator, but to guide the pollinator to the places where the plant needs them to go, to the pollen itself, for example, things like that. In the case of wind pollinated plants, there is no need for that. They're not depending on an organism to do the pollination. They're just producing a large amount of pollen, which gets liberated into the air and drifts about, and then fertilizes, falls onto the female parts of another plant, excuse me, and affects the fertilization. So there are no petals and things like that. But if you look at the actual individual flower, usually referred to as a floret, in the wind pollinator. Just what give me sorry, a little coughing jag there. This is referred to as a floret, and you can see that it has all of the reproductive structures that we associate with the other angiosperms, which we saw before. So, for example, here are male parts. This is typical, for example, for a grass floret. And you can do this. You can look at grasses when they flower. You can dissect out one of these florets, and you'll see all of these features. The males, here is an anther there, which is where the sporophyte produces the male spores, which is pollen. The male spores contain the male gametophyte, born on a filament here. Here is the ovary here. Inside the ovary would be the ovules. And the ovule here has a stigma there on which pollen will land to affect fertilization. There may be protective features as well, but these are not petals as they are in the true flowering plants. So here are the eudicotyledons, and more than 2/3 of angiosperm species are eudicotyledons. And most of the flowers that are familiar to you, many of our vegetables are eudicotyledons. Poppies, roses, peas, all of the legumes, things like that. These are all eudicotyledons, but not all eudicotyledons have are fertilized by a pollinator. There are many Dicotyledons which are fertilized by wind. And in particular, trees, many large trees, the oak trees and things like that, are wind pollinated. And they produce all of the reproductive structures, what are referred to as catkins. They don't have flowers, they have catkins. And the reproductive bodies are clustered together, much reduced surrounding elements, not petals and everything, but maybe some protective scales and everything like that. Okay, so there are a number of anatomical distinctions between the monocotyledons and the Dicotyledons. It is clearly, they are clearly a clade, but there are very distinct differences between the two groups, which extend all the way to their DNA as well. So the first we have already heard about. The primary distinction, gives them their name, is the fact that monocotyledons only have one cotyledon leaf. The first seed leaf is singular. In the Dicotyledons, the first seed leaves are duplicate. There are two of them. Second of all, with some exceptions, most monocotyledons have a leaf venation. If you look at the veins in the leaves, the leaf venation is parallel. There are some Dicotyledons which also have this parallel venation, so you have to be a little bit careful. But in general, the monocots have parallel venation. The Dicotyledons have a net-like, star-shaped venation, as would be familiar from any of the kind of leaves like the maple leaf or anything like that. We will talk next week about venation, about vascular structures, about how the conducting tubes of the plant work. That is the vascular structure. And in monocotyledons, the vascular structures are clustered together into vascular bundles, which are scattered throughout the stem and the root. So these are scattered all over the place. In the Dicotyledons, they are much more clearly organized into a ring-shaped structure like this. So here's a monocotyledonous stem scattered all over. Here is Dicotyledonous with them organized in a ring. Most monocotyledons do not have a taproot. They only have a net-like root system, and that is referred to as a fibrous root system. The Dicotyledons usually have a single taproot which extends through the soil and then branches from that taproot. The pollen of monocotyledons is quite distinctive because it only has one opening to it. Out of that opening is going to emerge the germination tube down which the sperm are going to be transported to fertilize the megaspore. Pollen grain of Dicotyledons, there are three slits, one there, and one on the other side here, out of which, any one of which the germination tube can emerge. And lastly, the monocotyledons, the floral parts, all of them, the sepals on the outside, the petals, then the structure of the ovary, all of these are arranged in multiples of 3. So here, for example, we have 3 petals here. These are actually sepals on the outside, but they look very like petals, so they're referred to as tepals. Then 3, and we see the same thing in the organization of the male and female parts as well. The floral organs in the Dicotyledons are arranged in multiples of 4 or of 5, more commonly 5, but 4 is often seen as well. So with that very brief overview of the angiosperms, let's just remind ourselves about the major derived traits of the seed plants in general. And first clear thing that we saw was the sporophyte is the overwhelmingly dominant feature of both gymnosperms and of angiosperms. And the gametophytes are reduced to microscopic stages. The male gametophyte is contained within a spore, which is the pollen grain. The female gametophyte is contained within the ovule here. And in the case of the angiosperms, the ovules are often organized into an ovary. Inside that, there is a female gametophyte here, which is the megasporangium, and it gives rise to a megaspore. This is the other distinction of the seed plants, that the pollen grain is actually a microspore. It is a small spore, while the large female gametophyte is a megaspore. Here it is here. The ovules are also a distinctive feature of both gymnosperms and angiosperms, but in the gymnosperms, the ovule is naked on the leaf, on the reproductive leaf. In the case of gymnosperms, it forms a cone. These form a cone, and contained in that is the diploid megasporangium here, and here is the megaspore here, produced by the megasporangium by meiosis. Here is the megaspore there, which is going to ultimately be fertilized. The other really huge advance of the seed plants is the development of the pollen grain, because the pollen grain, transported either by wind or by other organisms, frees the seed plants from a dependence on water for fertilization. All of the more primitive groups, the ferns, the mosses, all of those were dependent on water because sperm had to swim to the egg. Now the sperm is actually carried to the egg, to the megaspore, by the pollen, and actually a pollen tube grows to provide a passage for the sperm to reach the cells that it needs to fertilize. The next thing, of course, is the development of the seed itself. Seeds were a huge advance because they provided the embryo with a nutrient source, and they protected the embryo from desiccation and from predation. And it allowed for a certain period of dormancy of the embryo so that the seed can be transported far away from the parent plant. So by definition, a seed consists at the minimum of the embryo here, and then a food supply. Initially, that food supply is usually the endosperm. Later on, it may be derived from the cotyledons. Cotyledons take nutrient from the endosperm and transfer it to the embryo. Surrounding the seed is a seed coat, and that is derived from this covering here, which is called the integument. In the flowering plants, there may be further elaborations of this. The seed may be contained within a fruit. In the gymnosperms, there are some that have a very primitive fruit, and that is usually formed from a thin integument and an elaboration of the endosperm. But in the angiosperms, a true fruit surrounds the seed and either protects it, hardening up, or else becomes bulky and attractive to animals, birds, etc., to eat it, and in doing so, eat the seed and transport it away from the parent plant. And that is it, okay? And I will see you again, hopefully not hacking and coughing on Monday.